Welcome back, class, to Introduction to Political Science, and this week we'll be exploring democratic rule.
And here are learning outcomes for the week. We'll identify the types of democracy found historically and in the world today. We'll outline the historical waves of democratic expansion. We'll describe conditions needed in order for democracy to flourish, and we'll identify reasons why democracy is under threat today.
So the term democracy gets thrown around quite a bit. Let's drill into the textbook definition. We're talking about a political system where government is based on fair and an open mandate from qualified citizens within a state. Usually this takes the form of an election. The term democratization is the process by which states build their institutions and able to become democracies. So as states emerge, in some cases, from authoritarian systems, there's a process toward democratization. You don't get there right away. You need to build up certain institutions. There's a lot more to democracy than just simply having elections. Let's spend a minute or two on features of democratic rule from table 5.1 in your textbook. Some of the features we see are representative systems of government based on regular, fair, secret, and competitive elections. Again, representative systems means that you elect people to make decisions who serve in government, who serve in the legislature, who serve in the executive branch, and they're making decisions. There are some cases, obviously, of direct democracy in our political systems. We'll talk about those later. We have well-defined, stable, and predictable political institutions. You can sort of depend on these processes. And there is a distribution of powers in government with a system of checks and balances. And in most cases, this is mapped out in a clear constitution. There's a variety of forms of political participation that are available through institutions, including political parties that offer some meaningful choices. The United States has more of a two-party system, but most of the world has multi-party systems that offer different options for voters that help them make decisions and aggregate different interests, bring different interests together. There are limits on the power of government and protection of individual rights. We see this in the Bill of Rights in our Constitution. And this is sustained through an independent judiciary. And an independent judiciary has the power to check the elected branches of government. And in the case of the United States, declare the other actions of government as unconstitutional, as in violation of the rights and liberties that are protected in the United States Constitution. So that gives a great deal of power to our Supreme Court and our judiciary, which is to say to the other branches of government, you've exceeded your constitutional authority, or the law that you created exceeded the limits allowed by the Constitution. There should be an active, effective, and protected opposition. So if you just simply allow the majority unlimited power, that's really no different than mob rule. So you need laws and the ability to enforce those laws that protect those groups that are in the minority, those groups that may be in opposition. You also need a diverse and independent media, subject to limited political control, and to provide a way to share a variety of opinions. And so this kind of gets into the marketplace of ideas concept, that it's better to have more ideas out there, perhaps unregulated. Some of those sources are going to be highly flawed. But if you give too much power to the government to determine which media is appropriate or inappropriate, obviously you see that there are some problems there too. So having a diverse and independent media and a professionalized media, by the way, and a professionalized approach to journalism is so critical. The term democracy literally means rule by the many. It's self-rule. As practiced in ancient Athens, this is direct democracy, where adult male citizens are directly making laws, directly making political decisions. And while that might be functional in a city state, it's probably not going to work in a country of 320 million like the United States. And so that's why the United States is much more defined as a representative democracy and then also a liberal democracy. And by liberal democracy, I mean there are certain laws that are codified first and foremost in our Constitution that even if the majority wishes to do something, they are limited by these laws and limitations that are in our Constitution. Figure 5.1 goes over what I just introduced, which is the forms of democratic rule. Direct democracy, the Athenian example, which I just discussed. Again, representative democracies are those where people elect a legislature and maybe an executive branch if they're in a presidential system, and they make the decisions, okay? And they're held accountable for those decisions during regular elections. We do need to understand, too, the term liberal democracy, because this is confusing, because when we speak about a liberal in the United States, we think about somebody who specifically maybe aligns themselves with the Democratic Party, who has very liberal political viewpoints. But in this context, a liberal democracy is a form of indirect democracy where the power of the majority is limited by constitutional protections for the minority, whatever that group may be. And that means protecting individual rights and freedom of speech and press and assembly, freedom of religion, even if the will of the majority wants to limit those individual rights. And so that's sort of what we mean by liberal democracy, that democracy is constrained by a constitution and laws that limit the power of whatever group may be in the majority. We do have some examples of direct democracy in the United States. We have initiatives where citizens will initiate the process of creating a new law. We have Again, most democratic rule is representative. That is, people are not directly making political decisions, but they're selecting people to make those political decisions either through the legislature or in a presidential system, electing folks to the executive branch. Of course, there are real issues with this, but a direct Athenian-style democracy is probably not too workable in a country of 320 million people like the United States, and of course, considering how diverse the United States is. There are issues with how elections are structured. So, for example, in the United States, we have an electoral college to choose the president of the United States, and that allows a candidate to win the office even if they might lose the popular vote. Obviously attention given to political parties and candidates, that has to be, it has to go through the media, it has to go through new media or traditional media, and that may be unequal or uneven. There's real issues with regard to voter turnout and who can participate in elections. So elections tend to be skewed to wealthier people, older people, white people. These folks are disproportionately represented in voter turnout and also in the elected positions themselves. Of course, there can be issues with regard to manipulation of elections. And the broader question, too, is, should the representative that's selected, should they just simply adhere to what the voters want them to do, or should they exercise some degree of independence? And in many cases, we voters are in conflict amongst ourselves, right? We might want more Medicare benefits or more Social Security money, but we also might want to pay lower taxes. So sometimes the will of the voter is at odds with itself. I think I've already spent time with the concept of liberal democracy, and hopefully you understand the distinction between having liberal political views, or in the United States being somebody who's more left of center. That's different. Liberal democracy is one where the will of the majority, the democracy, is limited through constitutional and legal protections for individuals and whatever groups might be in the minority. The other aspect of liberal democracy is that government's limited. And if you take a look at the United States Constitution, a large component of the United States Constitution is not what the government must do, but it's what the government can't do. That's what I mean by limited government. And again, liberalism in this classic sense, not in the sort of liberal conservative ideology that we see in the United States, is based on the concept of natural rights, which we've already explored, and that individuals need protection from too much government. So that's what we mean when we're talking about liberalism in the classic sense as it refers to democracy. Civil liberties are rights that citizens have and things that the government can't do, areas that can't be restricted by the government. So if you look at the United States Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, is about civil liberties. It's about what the government can't do: infringement on speech, infringement on religious beliefs and practices, freedom of the press. These are things that government cannot infringe on. Now, as you know, there are limits to everything. No right or liberty is unlimited. There are regulations in all of these cases. So you have the right to free speech. Government cannot punish you for your speech, but you might be fired by an employer for your speech. That's different than sort of a government penalty. And likewise, certain forms of speech aren't protected as decided by the United States Supreme Court. So threats, creating a panic, going into a movie theater and shouting fire to create a panic, that is not protected speech. So even when we talk about civil liberties and things that government can't do, we also need to keep in mind that all liberties and rights have limits. Let's explore the relationship between modernization and democracy. To be a modern state, it means being industrial or post-industrial. Post-industrial means, perhaps less industrial capacity or manufacturing, but more information technology and innovation. So the United States certainly has a large industrial capacity, but the biggest growth in the United States is in its post-industrial economy. Higher levels of affluence, specialized occupations. So there's a great deal of occupations that require specialized training. The ability for social mobility, that is to say, you might be born into a blue collar family, but have the opportunity for education and training and to get a job perhaps as an engineer or as a scientist or something like that, to sort of just because you're born into certain conditions doesn't necessarily mean that you have to stay in those conditions. And that you've also got an urban and educated population. So that's what we mean by modern. And modernization is the process of getting there. Through much of the post-war years, we closely associated modernization with democracy. Although with the rise of China, we do see a successful authoritarian regime, an enduring authoritarian regime that has taken on certain aspects of modernization in terms of both industrializing and then creating more of a post-industrial economy, higher levels of social mobility, more specialized occupation, greater educational opportunities. And we've seen this within the authoritarian system within China. So China has allowed as much modernization as they're able to, and the authoritarian leaders are willing to do this to the extent that it doesn't challenge their rule, that doesn't challenge their leadership. So modernization does not necessarily go hand in hand with democracy, but if you look at modern democracies, you do see many more that are also advanced democracies. As with much in the study of political science, democracy is dynamic. There are democratic states that are advancing democratically, and there's more support for democratic institutions and a free press and a diversity of viewpoints and respect for those viewpoints, respect for the processes of democracy and elections. And that's what creates a full democracy. We're really only talking about 5% of the world's population that are in, the highest form of democracies. And then, of course, there are countries that are declining in their support for democracy and democratic culture and institutions. We've seen a decline in the United States, that there has been a loss of trust in public institutions. We've had elected officials that have stated that they won't abide by the outcome of an election if it doesn't work out the way they want it to. That's a good illustration of a declining political culture when those sort of statements are not only made but accepted. So, um, take a look in your reading about some of the characteristics that lead to a full democracy, more flawed democracy, and then you start to get into more hybrid systems that combine democracy and authoritarian elements, and then more authoritarian systems that are, sort of the opposite of democracies. As with our discussion of states last week and waves of state creation, there's also been waves of democracy, waves of new democracy creation. The first including Britain, France, the United States. Of course, we could and should have a discussion about when does democratization really occur? Is it, and we'll have that discussion here in a few minutes, is it when the United States is a new developing democracy, but of course, only a small fraction of the population are actually participating in voting and engaging with government? Is it after the Civil War when this starts to be expanded to African American men? Is it when women, um, uh, demanded and earned the right to vote in the early 20th century? Is it during the Civil Rights Movement in the late 1960s when finally there was federal enforcement and protection for voting rights for um, a larger percentage of the population? So anyway, I don't want to oversimplify this. Also, we see democratic backsliding. So you could argue in that first wave also included Germany, as Germany democratized. But, in the aftermath of World War II and then, I'm sorry, World War I, and then also, and in particular, the Great Depression, Germany slides back into authoritarianism. We see the rise of Nazism, the rise of Hitler. And so Germany would then again democratize after World War II. The third wave includes the democratization of Southern Europe and the remaining fascist regimes that were there, but also and mostly due to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the creation of new democratic states there, including Russia. Russia took initial steps to democratize, but we know now that Russia has returned to authoritarianism. So many of these states that start down the path of democratization may backslide to authoritarianism, or some form of hybrid system. Democratization is a process. The first day that authoritarian leaders are overthrown, that's not the creation of an enduring democracy. That's only the beginning. So here are the stages of democratization. Again, make sure that you understand this from your textbook. There's first part's liberalization. There are initial democratic reforms, usually as a recognition by authoritarian leaders that they need to do something to maintain power, that change is going to be inevitable. And if they don't try to, channel that power, that they'll be overthrown. Then there's transition. There's arrangements made for a new system of government. And this can happen through violence, or this can happen through more of a liberalization process. So sometimes this can be quite dramatic, sometimes not. And, we saw this in the former Soviet states, that ultimately it did not end in civil war. It ended up in the Soviet leaders recognizing that this transition was going to occur. Now, this is the key part here. Does democracy consolidate? Is there acceptance of this new system? Do people believe that it works? So, if you're in a former Soviet state, and let's say you're a border guard, and you're used to getting bribes every time somebody wants to enter or leave the country, just because you've got new leadership doesn't mean that you don't want your bribe anymore. It doesn't mean that maybe you don't need your bribe anymore. Think about judges who may be bribed, or police officers, or all the corruption that might go within and often goes within an authoritarian regime. And in fact, in many cases, in the early days of and through the process of democratization, we often see corruption rise because a powerful dictatorship or authoritarian regime is no longer there to challenge that. So in many cases, after an authoritarian regime is no longer there, when they've transitioned out, we will in many cases see corruption go up, not go down. So is there acceptance, this new democratic system of government, this new legal system, that this is something we should support? Also, in many cases, in the process of democratization, um, standards of living go down. People can no longer depend on the existing structures of government. Social services might weaken. It may become harder to get hold of basic food supplies. We saw this certainly with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the United States provided a great deal of food assistance during that period of time. When the previous structure breaks down like that, it can be very it can be very tempting for people to say, oh man, this democracy process isn't working. We need to go back to the way things were, back when we had a strong authoritarian leader that took care of us. So in many cases during this consolidation process, we see democratic backsliding. We see populations say, oh yeah, well, maybe it wasn't so bad. And again, using the Soviet Union as an example, through the chaos of the 1990s, ultimately many people came to the conclusion that um, a powerful authoritarian leader was something more in line with their political culture, and there was greater acceptance for that. There was a democratic backsliding. They didn't turn the corner toward a deeper democracy. And the final stage is when democracy is deep. It's not a superficial thing. It's not simply a constitution. It's a way of life. So again, if you take a look at the Russian Constitution today, it looks an awful lot like the American Constitution. There's supposed to be freedom of speech. There's supposed to be freedom of the press. There's supposed to be a federal system with a division of powers between the central government and regional governments. But that's not the way it works. President Putin, who's been there for decades now, he appoints the equivalent of governors to the different regions. He dominates the legislature. He overrides the judiciary. And so while their constitution is perfectly fine, they don't live that constitution. It's superficial. Okay. So the deepening process is when you move beyond the superficial to the substantial. Do you live that? And to a much greater extent, if you're using the United States as an example, the United States lives its Constitution. It's accepted much more deeply. Just a few more things on democratic consolidation. So this occurs when people see this as the only game in town, when people don't imagine acting outside democratic institutions. Likewise, democracies are in real trouble when people do consider acting outside democratic institutions, that maybe they will take power violently, or maybe they won't accept the outcome of a respected election. So it does kind of go in both ways. And there's a good quote here from the first democratic president of the Czech Republic, the former Czechoslovakia. And he said, President Havel said, "We've done away with totalitarianism, but we have yet to win democracy." This gives you an idea. Just because you end an authoritarian or totalitarian government doesn't mean you're a democracy. You haven't developed that. It hasn't consolidated yet, and it certainly hasn't deepened. We've explored this a bit already this week and last week, but there are some things that help democracy consolidate. We tend to see democracies that consolidate are wealthy overall. And it's not just the overall wealth of the country or the state, but it's how that wealth's distributed. So if all that wealth is in the hands of a few people, like you might see in, say, Saudi Arabia, that's not helpful to democracy. When you have a large middle class, when that is spread out. And so that's why when we do have discussions about the impact of income or wealth inequality, there is an overall impact on our overall democratic health. If we get to the point where all the money is in the hands of a few people, it's very destabilizing for democracies. So it's overall wealth, it's the size of the middle class, and then it is also the political culture. Do we have a culture that is accepting of democratic institutions? Do we have a political culture where people participate, but they don't, participate violently? They don't say, "Okay, hey, I got a parking ticket. I'm going to go burn down City Hall." Um, you want people to be engaged, but not so engaged that people resort to violence. Do you accept a difference of opinion? Can you hear a different point of view without, quickly moving to violence or conflict? Tolerance is such a key uh, aspect of the culture that's helpful to democracy. So there are cultural components, there are economic components that are very helpful, and that's why some countries make the transition to democracy so much um, more efficiently. So if you take a look at Western Germany after World War II, it had experience with democracy. It's an industrialized society, well-educated people, um, potentially wealthy, potentially having a large middle class. Western Germany made the transition back to democracy relatively efficiently. If you look after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Czech Republic had experience with democracy before Soviet rule. Again, many of those characteristics that I just mentioned. And so the Czech Republic was in a much better situation to make the transition to democracy. Russia, on the other hand, really had nobody in Russia at the time the Soviet Union collapse had any memory of democratic government. So many of these characteristics that we just explored were not there. A democratic culture wasn't there. So it probably shouldn't be too surprising that Russia did not make that transition to democracy and instead slid back to authoritarianism. Okay, well, what's the state of democracy today? What's the future of democracy in the world? As the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended, Francis Fukuyama put forward the idea that we're at a point that he referred to as the end of history, that democracy and democratic institutions, democratic states, they had triumphed. The future is going to be one of liberal democracy with shared political institutions, economic institutions, much more integration. Um, and that certainly seemed like that was going to be the case. The Soviet Union, particularly Russia, looked like it was transitioning and on a path to a liberal democratic model. We know now, though, that China and Saudi Arabia and Russia, they've gained in power since this period of time. They've created a sense of certain authoritarian stability. China has emerged as an economic authoritarian power, integrating enough in the globe to be part of the economic system, but certainly not giving up authoritarian power or rule. So there's some challenge to this concept of that we were at a end point to great power conflict. Today, too, we see a rise of populism. That is, political sentiment that is based on um, anti-elite feelings, anti-government institution feelings. Um, in many cases, populism particularly right-wing populism, relies on popular stereotypes, racial stereotypes, attitudes about immigrants coming into a particular country, and mobilizing people based on these popular ideas, and that the populist leader is on the side of the underdog, on the side of the person that's been victimized in many cases. So we do see a rise of populism in the world today, and this can be a mobilizing force. Sometimes we see it on the left, sometimes we see it on the right. But populist leaders, in many cases, will challenge democratic ideals, challenge democratic institutions, and suggest that they're fundamentally compromised or corrupt. Okay, to summarize, about half the people in the world today live in some form of democracy, though there's still no universal definition of what exactly constitutes a democracy. Athenian democracy was a form of direct democracy, and this stands in contrast to much of today's democracies, which are representative, they're indirect, We're selecting people to make our decisions for us, usually through elections. So that's the definition of a representative democracy. Liberal democracy is one that places limits on government and protects citizens' rights and liberties. And so countries like the United States are both a representative and a liberal democracy. You can be both. There's an association between democracy, modernization, and economic growth, although you don't necessarily have to democratize or to become a democracy to experience modernization and economic growth. China would be an example of that. The spread of democracy occurred in three distinct waves. But at the same time, there's real prospects as to whether or not democracy is continuing to advance. We're seeing a rise in populism in the United States and elsewhere, for examples, that are starting to question democratic institutions, questioning democratic norms. Democracy is specifically threatened by some of the internal shortcomings we see in major democracies, great divisions between political parties, between people with different political ideologies. And also, we're seeing the strength of confident authoritarian systems that are becoming more successful in an authoritarian model. And I'm thinking about China and Russia here in particular, but also Saudi Arabia. Here are your guiding questions for the week. They'll also be posted in the weekly discussion area. Make sure to follow the grading rubric carefully so that you get your full participation credit for the week. As always, please stop by during office hours, shoot me an email, or post on D2L if you have any questions or concerns.